Good day, everybody, and welcome to the Great Books of China series. Today, I'm going to introduce a new subject. I've talked before about Chinese prose, some Confucian culture, general terms in Chinese culture, but so far I have talked nothing about poetry, which really is a subject very dear to my heart. So I'm going to focus the discussion today on the poet Du Fu. And Du Fu is a name that you're probably familiar with if you know anything at all about Chinese literature. So the top two names of Chinese poetry that everybody is familiar with are always Li Bai on the one hand and Du Fu on the other. And they both lived in the Tang dynasty. They were contemporaries in the 8th century. And posterity has more or less decided to split the crown of the poetic Chinese language between them. There is this phenomenon in every language, or most languages at least, of a certain writer who, through pure, almost Darwinian staying power, manages to be deemed the greatest, the one greatest by other readers and writers throughout the centuries. In English, it's Shakespeare, of course. In German, it's Goethe. In Italian, it's Dante, Virgil in Latin, Homer in Greek, and so on. And in Chinese, for some reason, out of over 2,000 years of poets, general consensus have now for hundreds of years agreed that it's Li Bai and Du Fu who are the two greatest ones. So in Chinese, there are two of these. The other language I can think of immediately that has more than one on the top is French. They don't seem to have decided on any single one as their one great canonical author. But many other languages have such writers. And I think I've touched a little bit on this phenomenon before, because I think it's a very fascinating topic. Very often this sort of thing is looked upon as some kind of conspiracy almost. As if, some people in certain institutions and certain ideological aims, that they agree to promote one old dude at the expense of every other equally deserving writer out there. And this is, of course, horribly unfair to everybody, and it's patriarchal, and it's sinister, and you name it. And even if you're not inherently critical towards this kind of phenomenon, which I'm not, it can still lead to a kind of oversaturation that I'm also very familiar with, where you've heard so much praise and so much talk being attached to certain names that you just don't want to read them anymore almost. It seems like you already know the topic, that it's a topic that's been done to death for so long. And it's not the case, of course, that these writers are everybody's personal favorites, which I guess is part of the problem, because we live in such an individualistic age that if the canonical author is not your favorite, then the canon is, of course, oppressive and corrupt and not worth your time. Well, of course. I'm not saying that it should be that way, that everyone has to agree personally that they love this writer the most. That's by no means the case. If you're a lover of literature, you always have your own favorites that it seems to you that nobody talks about and nobody understands. And you're nobody, there's nobody who can talk you out of the position, for example, that Emily Dickinson should be less interesting than Shakespeare, for example. And I take that example because Emily happens to be my literary love above all. And that's also fine, of course. I mean, this phenomenon of literary love is also a very interesting one. And I think it would be terribly dreary if that didn't exist. That's like every man has his own wife, and he's not forced to admit that Miss Universe is the more beautiful. That would be horrible if that was the case. You fall in love with certain writers for reasons that are entirely personal. And just like love for a real person, it's a portal into unique and unprecedented experiences and insights. But this phenomenon that cultures, not individuals, cultures over long periods of time tend to agree on the preeminence of certain writers, I think that's something much more mysterious than merely a sociological or ideological process, which it's often looked upon as today. It's like a whole culture collectively has this love affair with the works of a certain writer that they simply can't get enough of. And in sociology, there's something called the Pareto distribution, which originally referred to the observation that roughly 80% of wealth in a society is held by roughly 20% of the people. And this kind of ratio turns up everywhere. So like 80% of the people live in the 20% largest cities, and 80% of the drinks ordered in a bar are among the 20% common ones, and so on and so forth. This Pareto distribution turns up everywhere. And when you go to the very end of the Pareto distribution, you always find some lone giant which is taking like a huge slice of the pie all by themselves. And that's more or less what it's like with Du Fu in Chinese literature, or with Shakespeare in English literature. And just think about this for yourself. I just said the example of cocktails in a bar. Like, how many percent of the cocktails ordered in a bar is a gin and tonic? I'm just guessing right now, but it should be something like 10-20%. Maybe it's more than that. And there's like 100 drinks on the menu. So it's no exaggeration to say that humankind has a kind of love affair with a gin and tonic. And it's the same thing with literature, but when it comes to literature, it's even more mysterious, because there you have, really, I think what it is the phenomenon of collective love for a single person. And these few select writers, like Shakespeare and Dante and Du Fu and Li Bai, they're something more than people, because they're like, they turn into essential, they reveal themselves to be essential incarnations of a whole tribe of human beings. And they turn into the pole by which these tribes of people order their value systems. And very often it's the case that these people, like with Du Fu, for example, that they pass through life in a complete obscurity. And then a couple of centuries later, it's like the whole culture can't be imagined without them. And it's such a strange thing that cultures do this. Because you have to remember, we're not talking here about the phenomenon of sacred scripture. That's a somewhat different phenomenon. And we're also not talking about the concept of intellectual classics in a certain field of endeavor, like the works of Aristotle or of Newton, because there it's obviously the pure, inescapable intellectual splendor that we're dealing with. And that's much more straightforward. And of course, this phenomenon has even less to do with classics of ideological thought, like the works of J.S. Mill or Karl Marx or the Founding Fathers or something like that. The thing is that mankind has never agreed about what they need poetry or writers of literature for. But we do, that much is clear, because they're worshipped in essence, in effect, they're worshipped by all traditional cultures. And I would say that of the categories I mentioned, the phenomenon is closest to the one with religious scripture. But the secret here, which almost nobody understands, is that poetry is even more basic than that. It's more fundamental to a culture than religious scripture. And there's a very interesting saying, which I think was first applied to romantic poetry, which is that it is spilt religion. And this saying basically expresses, briefly speaking, that poetry as such is something religious, or animated by the spirit of religion. And of course, if you're a lover of literature, you know that lovers of literature are no strangers to the enormous spiritual force of certain literary experiences. But this formulation is still only halfway right. And my position is that of Harold Bloom, who turned this on its head, and he said that religion is spilt poetry. And that's exactly right. That's how it is. Because a lot of poetry doesn't make sense as religion. Maybe a lot of romantic poetry does, but not poetry in general. And poetry is much too vast to be poured into the vessel of religion. But all religious writings can be read as poetry. And if they can't, they're false religion. That's a criterion that I've found very useful. And what I'm saying now should by no means be understood as a debasement of religion. I'm not dissing religion here. You have to put that thought as far from yourself as possible right now. What I'm doing is giving poetry its rightful place, because it's never given its rightful place. The thing is that religion can be grasped by the poetic mind, but poetry cannot be grasped by a religious mind. Conventionally understood, at least, if you say conventional religion. And this is what I have found, at least. If you want to redeem the word religion, I guess you can say that the highest religion is poetry, but that's semantics. You can just as well say that religion is the highest form of poetry. which again is closer to the truth. But these two are still very close to each other, and I think it's a big problem that our culture sees them as so separate. I think most people can't even see the necessary connection between them. Because religious stories, rituals, artworks, doctrines, it's only the living breath of poetic vision that can animate them and make them into living things. And then these things become mobile temples. They're eternal abodes for the culture and for the individual that manages to embody them. But apart from that, religions are not the flower, not in themselves. They're only congested and ossified remembrances of poetic vision. And poetry, on the other hand, if it's not taken religiously seriously, it becomes a meaningless amusement, which is exactly how most people today look at it. But in fact, poetry is more important than religion. It's the more noble category of the two. And certain religious literature, of course, like the Hebrew Bible or the Bhagavad Gita, which are in themselves poetic works of the highest order, they can be this flower. They really are. And every true religion, as I said, they do have some literary work of comparable power that sits at the bottom of the religion. It doesn't matter which religion you're talking about, you will find something like this. But the true relation of poetry and religion still looks like this. Poetry comes first, because poetry is something that flows forth in the minds of genius from their immediate experience and vision of the present, actually living in the world. So the real world, lived experience in the here and now, in its fullness, that is the fountain. That's the flower of flowers. And it starts with a vision. And then their vision is encapsulated in their poetry by means of their perfection of the art of language. So it takes a twofold genius to be a great poet. You need the genius of seeing and the genius of saying. Seeing and saying. And then it happens in certain cases that the surrounding culture takes sort of collective decision that this poetry is important enough to erect monuments around it. And that might be churches, priesthoods, it might be universities, professorships, it might be commentaries and sub-commentaries, you name it. And then this process turns the poetry into something that looks more and more like a religion. But religion is nothing more than an inherited poetic vision. And that's not to say that religions are false. You have to note this. I'm not saying that religions are false. On the contrary, I'm saying that what is true about them is true in the same way as great works of poetry are true. And it's when you come from this perspective that I think it's obvious that there is no practical difference between the worship of Shakespeare and the worship of Christ for the English-speaking world. They are very, very similar phenomena. But poetry still comes first. And if we go back to the theme for today, Dufu, the Chinese culture has this very special characteristic that I've gone into a little bit in previous episodes, that the Confucian tradition that they inherit, which you could say in a way is their religion, this Confucian tradition is what we would call rather secular in its outlook. So if we look at the saints and prophets, as it were, of the Confucian and the Taoist traditions, they're more like the Indo-European wisdom figures, like Socrates and Buddha, than the Semitic tradition of Moses, Jesus, Mohammed, which the West has inherited as its religious tradition. Because the Chinese sages, they provide revealed wisdom direct from the sources of nature, you could say, without posing as the spokesman of a transcendent being like Jesus, Allah, Moses, and Mohammed, of course. And because there was also in China, they didn't have this sociological phenomenon of a priesthood around this Confucian tradition. So the canon was never really finished. Everybody was sort of free to kind of make their own contribution to the canon if they thought they were up to it. And I think that's basically what happened to Dufu. Because Chinese writers of all ages are always lamenting the fall of the Golden Age and its ideals, and that there are no men like Emperor Shun or Confucius around anymore. But in principle, they're always waiting for people like those to come along and they try to make themselves like that all the time. It's not like in Islam, for example, where revelation of the truth is declared to be finished after Muhammad. It always goes on. And Du Fu is such a person. When you read traditional commentary on his works, it's obvious that he's considered close to infallible. And not just as a writer of poetry, but also as a moral example. And I talked a little bit in the last video about the close ties that these things had for the Chinese tradition. And if you look at Du Fu and Li Bai, who always was the other main contender for the Chinese poetic throne, this is probably also why tradition has given Du Fu a little bit of an edge on Li Bai, because Du Fu's conduct has been generally more admired than Li Bai. But on the other hand, Li Bai has always been the favorite of the more eccentric and individualistic and less conservative elements of Chinese society. So they're very different personalities, even though they're equally talented, and they kind of complement each other. So I guess that's why tradition hasn't been able to definitely choose between them. But what I want to get at here is that Du Fu has always been treated with something that's close to religious veneration by the Chinese. It's as if his poetic works could be said to complement the great scriptural classics. And it's actually not uncommon to read comparisons with the works in the Shi Jing, the classic of poetry, in critical comments on Du Fu. And speaking of critical comments on Du Fu, it's now only 4 years ago, in 2014, that the lovers of Du Fu were graced with a gift of a new, authoritative, annotated version of his complete works. So if you read Chinese, right now you're in a better position than ever to really take a deep dive into the world of his words. And this is the reason why I'm reading Du Fu now, is because basically I came across these books and I just had to get this set when I saw it. I fell in love with it at first sight. There's hardly anything I love better in the world than a scholarly production of this caliber. It's just stunning. This was just one of the volumes. It's 12 volumes all in all. So this is a seriously in-depth production. And then I paid like 500 yuan for it, which is new, which is like completely ridiculous, you know. And Du Fu, he wrote over 1,400 poems, and then there's some prose thrown in as well. So there's a lot of ground to cover in these books. But the editors here, they aren't sparing any energy. There are pages of notes and commentary for every single poem. It's so good. And the thing I really love about this set is also that it is, as it should be, strictly historical. So the ambition here was to draw from the best of Du Fu scholarship during the past millennium into a more or less handy set for professional and enthusiast alike. So reading it is like reading the whole scholarly and poetic conversation of 2,000 years along with these poems, because you get, on the one hand, everyone that Du Fu had been drawing on himself in the composition of the poems, and then you get all the later discussion and commentary by other people after him, and it's very, very useful. I just can't sing the praises of a work like this high enough. This stuff is heaven, and it was 40 years in the making, and it shows. Yeah, what should I say? And when you read this stuff, you might think, like, why do you need so much commentary? And this is not the commentary that you might think. It's not arbitrary opinions of people. It's solid references and quotes to relevant writers throughout the ages on like every word, every line. All the doubtful and debated points are referenced from several different perspectives, that you're really put in a position to make up your own mind and use your own judgment. This is what like a culture that respects its readers to see, and expects them to seriously engage in this dialogue with its canonical writers. This is what it looks like. It's such a complete joy to read, to me. It's the embodiment of a great culture's love affair to an inescapable poet. This is what it looks like. And it's the best way to really try to understand and appreciate what it is that this culture, the Chinese culture in this case, what it is that they're so crazy about with this poet. So then you probably wonder, what do I think that they're so crazy about? And first of all, I'll start out by pointing out that I'll probably make quite a few episodes on Du Fu here, because there's such a lot of material in these books and I learned such a lot from reading them. But I have to start somewhere. I've only read like 1.5 of these volumes yet, so there's like 7 times as much still left to cover. And these poems are arranged chronologically, so what I've been reading so far is only the earliest preserved poetry of Du Fu. And dating and ordering these poems is, of course, a whole science in itself, which you get quite a bit of insight into also by reading this work. Okay, so brief sum up about Du Fu's life then. He lived between 712 and 770. So the central event of his life, and the lives of all of his contemporaries, was of course the absolutely devastating An Lushan rebellion, which broke out in the end of 755 and ended 7 years later with the glorious Tang dynasty absolutely torn to shreds. And I think if it wasn't for this rebellion, it's possible that Du Fu wouldn't have achieved the position in Chinese literature that he has held ever since. But he lived through all of it, and a lot of his fame rests on the poems from this war period. And this to the degree that he is frequently labeled the poet historian by later writers. And some of these poems from this time are also among the most popular Chinese poems of all times. So what people mostly like to talk about, like the archetypal image of Du Fu that exists in the Chinese popular mind, that's primarily his sympathetic depictions of all the undeserving victims of war, of the brutality and the suffering and the corruption and senselessness and the destruction of the war period, but specifically how it affects this little person, the individual person in this, at the same time as he always has a very large perspective on it, where it's on the one hand it's the whole empire, on the other hand it's the little individual. And well, as far as I've read in this chronological ordering, the rebellion has just started, so there's a lot of ground to cover yet, but this is just a little preview on what Du Fu is writing about. I haven't said much in this series so far about Chinese poetry in general. There are a few general characteristics which are quite noteworthy in contrast with traditional Western modes of poetry, so I thought I should talk a little bit about that right now. The first thing is that if you look at the 3 traditional divisions of poetry which we have inherited from Greece, epic, lyric, and dramatic poetry, epic and dramatic, they don't exist at all in China. From the position of the ancient Western position, it's the least important of these categories, the lyric one, that dominates from the start and always did. Of course, this comparison doesn't really make sense. I'm not trying to force Chinese writing into Western categories, but it's still a remarkable thing about Chinese poetry, this almost total absence of longer forms. And you probably are familiar with the fact that there's a certain terse and epigrammatic quality to Chinese writing, or classical Chinese writing in general, which I think probably is related to the special characteristics of the Chinese script, which is like these non-alphabetic and logographic symbols. And consequently, when you look at the great classics of Chinese poetry, very few single works are longer than a couple of pages. So these poets, they were not trying to produce single monumental works. It's not like the Iliad, the Aeneid. They were like very much content with expressing themselves in a multitude of shorter works. And this, of course, relates also a little bit to what I talked about in the last episode. It's like how literature in general was seen as inseparable from the expression of individual character. So there is this assumption always in reading Chinese literature that you're at least as interested in the personality of the poet as you are in the subject matter of his poetry, or the stylistic, or the literary, or the uh, vocabulary, or anything else of the poet. So um, that's a very important feature of Chinese poetry. And there's also always an assumption of authenticity, that the poet is not writing fiction. He's honestly expressing himself as precisely as he can and is allowed to by the circumstances of the poem's composition. No fiction. It's like, especially not in this serious lyric poetry that Du Fu writes, the so-called shi. Mm, and that's one thing that's really different from Western poetry when you look at Chinese poems. And another thing that's sort of impossible not to notice when you start reading this kind of poetry is that a large part of the average Chinese poet's output always consists of what in the West is known as occasional verse. And occasional verse is poems that are written to a certain occasional, certain social occasion, you could say, written to a certain social occasion. They either serve some directly purely social function, like congratulation, greeting, consoling. It can even be more or less hidden or more or less discreet requests for patronage and favors. Or if it's not that, at least it's describing a mood or a reflection at a given social occasion. It can be a dinner or a visit or a party or a journey or something else. And this kind of stuff, how to say? I mean, usually it's, to say the least, I think you can say that it's very, very underwhelming as poetry to a Westerner of a classical bent, because we like our poetry to be about like the fall of Troy, the justification of the ways of God to man, or if it's not as grandiose as all that, at least we're used to poems that treat of immortal things as intellectual beauty. And if we then get a poem in our hands that says like farewell dinner to executive attendant Liu, with investigating censor Zhang attending, then it's like, it doesn't really cut it as material for poetry. It's like, even before you start reading, you wonder to yourself, like, why do I care about this farewell dinner for these nobodies 1,200 years ago? And that's one problem with approaching this poetry. You have to get rid of this kind of mindset that sees these things as unimportant. And the other problem is, of course, that because it's like that, a lot of this stuff takes a lot of background knowledge in order to be even intelligible. Because obviously, such poetry has a certain social meaning, which is so intimately bound up with its meaning as poetry. And if you can't make sense of the background, you won't make sense of the poem either, which means that you usually need a lot of general knowledge of the historical epoch, social norms, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you need quite a lot of specific knowledge about the persons involved on that particular occasion, and the various intrigues and specific social happenings and whatever that inform this particular situation. And that's exactly what a good annotated edition like this one supplies you with. And another thing is that this poetry, this is something you probably know if you've read any Chinese poems at all, is that it's usually very, very dense, linguistically speaking. There's a lot of information in every line. And that's partly because conciseness is viewed as a kind of general virtue. It's always considered, it's like almost like a competition, how much content you can squeeze into 10 characters or something like that. And the language and the script lends itself very well towards that kind of expression. But at the same time, it makes this stuff damn near close to untranslatable. You can translate it, but it becomes rubbish. I've actually never come across any decent translations of Chinese poetry that I would personally enjoy reading for pleasure, for fun, as it were. It's as if you have this magic in the language that is so complete and it's so formal in a way that when you try to transfer it to another medium, it's bound to fail. And actually, when it comes to Du Fu, just to give an example, there's a free English translation of his complete works by an amazing guy called Professor Stephen Owen. And it's available online, and it took him like 8 years or something to complete. And it's just awful. The most gracious thing you can say about his translations are that they're like decent paraphrases, but they're nothing like independent poems. And they convey zero of the dazzle and the power of the originals. I downloaded parts of his book because I was curious when I saw this, and I started reading a few random poems, but I just had to stop. It was just too damn painful. And I don't say that because I feel qualified to really make any substantial improvements on his efforts, because this is just exactly what happens anytime anybody feels an urge to translate classical Chinese poetry into a Western language. So I guess that kind of dooms Chinese poetry from ever reaching a large audience in the West, but hey, that's what I'm trying to do anyway. Anyway, the poem that I've chosen to translate as the text for this episode is called Climbing the Ci'en Temple Pagoda with Friends. 同诸公登慈恩寺塔. Actually, that's also another thing about reading Chinese poetry. We don't really know what this stuff sounded like back then, because the pronunciation has changed as well. What I said right now, that's exactly how it didn't sound to Dufu. So a lot of the melody and a lot of aspects of the sort of that are bound up with the pronunciation are completely inaccessible to us now if we haven't made serious study into the phonetics of this period, which is just, I think it's way beyond what anybody can manage in one lifetime. But still, climbing the Ci'en Temple Pagoda with friends. The friends on the occasion included another poet, Gao Shi, whose poem from the same day also survives, interestingly enough. And the pagoda in the title actually still exists also. It's the one that we today know as the Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an, or at least it's a predecessor to the present tower. I'm actually not sure which. I've personally been at this tower in Xi'an quite a few times, and it's obviously ancient. You can even see that it leans slightly to one side, but I haven't looked into exactly how old the present tower is. This is what it looks like today, anyway. Now, just a little bit more background. I said that Chinese poetry basically does away with long forms and with dramatic forms, and that it also basically doesn't treat history and mythology. It's very focused on the here and now. But all of this exists in the poem as background, and you will see this in this poem. And even if it doesn't function as fiction, it can still be extremely suggestive. It's not just, oh, it tells you what you're doing right here and now. It sounds so boring. What it does, at best, is to provide this hyper-real, concentrated, extremely literary and flowery and decorated world picture that's filtered through the personal vision of the author's individual mind. It's like you're supposed to see the whole cosmos for the first time through this poem. And that's what it manages to do in certain cases. And this poem, I think, is one of those. And you have to try to see like the author's personality, the prophecy, the prophetic summary of the times that exists in this poem, and this eternal picture of a mental reality beyond time in just a few lines. If you try to see those qualities in this poem, it starts to come alive. And I think this poem is extremely successful in doing this, and that's why I've tried to translate it like this for this episode. And it's just 24 lines. Okay, here it is. See this monument vaulting through vast azure sky, circling tireless winds, blowing on without rest, whose ascent multiplies every anguish and fear in each fettered and small-hearted breast. Teaching through power of symbolic truth our foot to walk paths of profoundest thought, and our eye to pierce this dragon-dense gloom, to emerge from the darkness of crutch and support. See the 7 stars approach from the north, hear the galaxy thunder its westerly course, where the sun is lashed on its way by the god, and in heights of clearness Lord Autumn walks. See the mountains of earth, fragments at our feet, where the capital's rivers pale from our eyes, for below all is wrapped in one primeval mist, and the emperor's city is lost in the haze. We shout out to the deeps for a ruler like Tsuen, but his grave is shrouded with dark clouds of doom, tears for futile drinking from courtesans' founts, and for unceasing feasting in fantasy lands. The swan takes to wing in breathless retreat, to deposit his cries he knows not where, while each bird who by instinct can follow the heat hunts his grain of the day with successful pursuit. And that's it. And this poem is considered to have been written in 752, so it's a few years before the Civil War breaks out. And some historical background then. The ruling emperor, Xuanzong, whose given name was Li Longji, is one of the most famous emperors in Chinese history at all. And he reigned for 44 years. And during his early days, he presided over what really is remembered as the cultural and military peak of the Tang dynasty. This really was the period where the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, when it was really the superpower of Asia for a few years. And today, when people talk about the Tang dynasty, it's still Tang Xuanzong, this emperor, that people's thoughts go to first. But it's not just all those good things. It's also the mismanagement of the empire during the later parts of his reign. It's the absolute disaster of the Civil War, and his very inglorious end as emperor that together forms the saga of Xuanzong, which is also the general saga of the Tang dynasty in miniature, you could say. So there's the power and the glory, and then the hubris and overextension, and after that the inevitable fall. And in this case, carrying with it millions, hurtling into the abyss. And the most famous story connected to Xuanzong was his love affair with a woman called Yang Guifei, who was his favorite consort during the later years. And in popular imagination, this has obviously been kind of mythologized during the past 1,200 years. But in popular imagination, it was his infatuation with this woman which led him to leave the rule of the empire to various warring factions and eventually make this rebellion possible. So whatever might be the more complex real-world factors that all went into creating this perfect storm that the Anlushan rebellion was, their love affair, which was also noted for the extreme expenses and luxury of their private life, this has all become kind of a symbol for the corruption of the dynasty. And it was apparent also to the contemporaries, as well as being a warning example for later generations. So that's what Du Fu is referencing here when he says, tears for futile drinking from courtesans' founts and for unceasing feasting in fantasy lands. Actually, I've been very liberal with the translation here for exactly those reasons that I pointed out just a few minutes ago. The language of the original here contains a compressed mythological reference, which it might be worth teasing out for the analysis here. A more literal translation would be, alas, the drinking from alabaster pool, the daily feasting at Mount Kunlun. And these mere terms, alabaster pool and Mount Kunlun, Yao Chi and Kunlun Qiu, they need no footnote for a literate Chinese. It's obvious what they reference. They are a literary reference to the story of the legendary King Mu of the Zhou dynasty, whose journey to the west is the subject of an ancient work. And King Mu was a historical king of the Zhou dynasty. He lived for real in the 10th century BC, but the story we have about him is pure mythology. It tells of how he set out on this long journey to the west in order to find the blessed lands of the Queen Mother of the West, and there to obtain the fruit of immortality. And the Queen Mother of the West, Xi Wangmu, is this really ancient Chinese goddess. You have her mentioned already on the oracle bones. So that's a very, very early mythology. And he, the king, King Mu, he goes up the Kunlun Mountains, which stand at the far western end of the universe, and he reaches the domain of the goddess, this Queen Mother. And this Queen Mother, she's really like a utopian female. The female as a dispenser of blessings, you could say. And he feasts with her on the shores of this lake, the Alabaster Lake, Yao Chi, and it's like he has reached the goal of his travels. But in the end, he does not learn the secret of immortality, but he has to return home and die. And if you look at the historical King Mu, not just the mythological version of him, he is actually supposed to have enlarged the domains of the Zhou kingdom, which he was the king of back then. And he's said also in the historical sources to have led this huge army westward to fight the western tribes. So there's like a factual basis for the later mythological embroidery, you might say. And there's also this curious parallel between the mythical King Mu and Xuanzong, who was the emperor in Du Fu's time. And he weaves them together a little bit in this poem, because Emperor Xuanzong, he also constantly sent armies westward to maintain and expand the empire's domains in that direction. And the Tang dynasty actually ruled over large parts of Central Asia back then. But when you come to this point in history, just a few years before the outbreak of the rebellion, it seemed to everyone that the emperor is now just living in this utopian la-la land with his favorite consort. So there's like a parallel there between the mythological story of King Mu and Xuanzong, and this is what Du Fu talks about in just these 2 lines. This is an example of squeezing in quite a lot of information in just 10 characters. And everyone was worried about this back then. This is the general historical background for every poem and every writing back then. Everyone was worried about the fact that the emperor seemed to be losing his grasp on the empire, and that power was instead slipping to people like this commander, An Lushan, who was to rebel shortly afterwards, and the prime minister Yang Guozhong, who was a relative of the Yang Guifei, the favorite consort. And that's the background to this poem. So now, here Du Fu is. He is climbing this tower with his friends, and he describes that he ascends the tower, which also here seems to stand for the height of poetic inspiration, the symbolic truth, as he says. And he looks down, and he sees the whole empire as one undifferentiated mist. And he sees the grave of the ancient sage emperor, Shun, which is shrouded in black clouds. And now, if you know this minimum of historical background, it lends quite more substance to this very mighty image. And there's another little image here that also disappears in my translation, which is the line, "The capital's rivers pale from our eyes," which in the original is "the Jing and the Wei cannot be found," which carries its own significance, and I chose not to translate them because I value general intelligibility in poetic translations. But these 2 rivers, the Jing and the Wei, are 2 real rivers, and they flow together at a point slightly north of the imperial capital of Chang'an. And they're special because, and the reason because they're a poetic image is because one of them, I never remember which one, I think it's the Wei, always carries with it a lot of sediment, and the other one doesn't. So at the point where they flow together, it was very easy to visually separate the waters of these 2 rivers, because the one was muddy and the other was clear. I don't know if that's the case anymore. I can imagine that they're both as dirty today, but just pretend that the 20th century and the 21st century never happened here. Obviously, when you stand at the top of the tower and you look out of the empire and you can't see the muddy and the clear rivers, they're lost to view. That's like a picture of the whole concept of right and wrong, like the moral compass having disappeared from the empire as well. So that's also a much more ominous image than the original, if you know what it stands for, but it's really hard to translate in a sensible way. And another thing I really like about this poem is that it's like a meta poem as well, because it's not just about ascending the tower with friends, and it's not just about the historical situation which surrounds them. All that is baked into it, but it's also kind of a meta poem because it describes the powers of poetry in itself as the part of its own structure. Because if you're a simple-minded person, you might think, okay, it's just he's climbing this tower, and then you think that the impression is that he's merely putting a lot of hyperbolic description on top of that. But there's much more to it, because level 2, you might say, is that you have to remember also that this is not just any tower. It's the sacred tower of a Buddhist temple. And it's actually not just any old temple either, but the Ci'en Temple, founded under imperial auspices by the great pilgrim Xuanzang, who founded it to edit and translate all the scriptures that he had brought back from his travels in India. So it has quite its own mythological significance, this tower, and the temple it is in. And the poem actually makes a reference to this Buddhist context when it says the symbolic truth, the xiang jiao, which literally means the teaching of images. The teaching of images is actually a Buddhist term. It's a term for Buddhist religion as it is and as it has to be in the age of darkness, where the true Buddhist teaching has been so diluted and forgotten that it's no longer actually present in the world, but only exists in images and words. So the geographical location itself invites to a visionary text, and it also bakes this Buddhist visionary context into it as well. So you have the geographical location and you have the Buddhist reference, and you get like the perfect context for a vision, poetic vision. And that's level 3, more or less, because you can interpret this teaching of images as more than just Buddhist religion, Buddhist doctrine, but more broadly as Dufu's poetic art in itself. And that's how I read these lines. And our eye to pierce the dragon-dense gloom to emerge from the darkness of crutch and support. Because true poetic vision is something that allows you to penetrate the worldly mist of dragons and snakes and emerge into a world of perpetual clearness, inhabited by the gods. And this ascent in the poem is parallel to the ascent up the narrow staircase of the temple tower, among the beams and rafters that support the tower. So this crutch and support also has at least a double meaning here. Because when you get up to the heights, you don't have these crutches and supports any longer, which makes the heights terrifying, which it says in the beginning, whose ascent multiplies every anguish and fear in each fettered and small-hearted breast, because it's only to a person of true poetic vision that the utter chaos and horror of the world becomes truly visible as well. If you're not a poet, you also have the privilege of living in darkness. You don't see everything as clear, and that might in some way be a blessing, because as a poet you get the entire world. It's like a give all take all offer. You get to live as the neighbor of the gods, as it says, with a sun lashing with a god lashing the sun on its way and so on. But as a poet at the height of vision, the precariousness of worldly existence as such is also more apparent to you. And the impending doom of a corrupt society is clearly visible before your eyes all the time as well. It's like you know what's going to happen. Things are not going well. It's going to end in disaster. So this poem is really an ode to poetic vision as such, at the same time as it is all these other things. A vision of the corrupt society and so on. And I think that deserves its own little meditation, which I'll leave to you to complete by yourselves. And I'll just close off this episode by summarizing the use of poetry that we learned from this poem. The use of poetry that I'm sure I will get back to in the future as well. The use of poetry is this. It is to cultivate this seeing eye, so that we can break through the miasma of the dragon den that we live in and exchange that for serene autumnal skies. And from that visionary height to treat the corruption in your own soul, which also is the corruption of your society. Have a good day, you all, and thanks for listening.